So in today's video, we are going to be discussing the Minnesota Vikings chances in the NFC North. Now, before we get into the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's jump right into the video. So with the Minnesota Vikings, I think they have a very solid chance of competing in their division. Do I think it's going to be easy? No, because if you look at the Green Bay Packers, they still have an unbelievable defense. They have Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. The Packers may have lost a lot of key pieces on their offense. Obviously, Devontae Adams, they lost MVS. And on the defensive side of the ball, Zadarius Smith, of all people, signed with the Minnesota Vikings. But with the Minnesota Vikings, I do think that they are a team that can make some noise in their division, because they're a team that, if we're going to look at their team from last year, they are a team that honestly was very close. And I mean by a hair away from being a team that probably makes the playoffs last year. Because if we're looking at the Vikings, obviously they missed the playoffs last year, as we mentioned. But I think if we're looking at the team I think was talented enough last year to make the playoffs. They are a team that was very close to making the playoffs last year. And I can't emphasize enough how close the Minnesota Vikings were to being a team that could have made the playoffs last year. So we're going to look at some of the games that they could have won. So the games that the Vikings could have won last year, we look at week 1 against the Bengals. Dalvin Cook fumbles in overtime at the Cincinnati 38. That's a game right there. The Vikings, if Dalvin Cook doesn't fumble, they win that game. Week 2 against the Cardinals, they miss a field goal with 4 seconds left. In week 9, they couldn't take advantage of a Lamar Jackson interception in overtime. So again, another game that's in overtime that they probably have a chance to win. You have the defensive collapse in week 13 against the Lions. Obviously, they don't make the silly mistake they made against the Lions. That's an easy win right there. And then there was even more games that were winnable, games that were very close. You had week 4 against the Browns. They lost 14-7. They had week 8 against the Cowboys where they lost 20-16. Like, this team constantly played in one possession games, and that was the story of their entire season. It basically felt like the Vikings literally were a team that was so close. They had 14 one possession games last year in 2021, and they were 6-8 in those games. So obviously the Vikings were a team that you weren't just going to push over and beat, but they were a team that lacked the ability to close out games. That is basically the moral of this story. Now, we'll get into it later, but you could chalk that up to a many different of issues. And then there was that game against Pittsburgh that was absolutely insane. That was almost a brutal loss for the Vikings. Luckily, they pulled that one out, but they had a 29-0 lead in that game, and it literally came down to the final play of that entire game. And if it hadn't been for Chase Claypool acting like a fool and pointing for the first down like he did with, around 40 seconds left in that game, you give the Steelers that time back that Chase Claypool acted like that, the ball fumbled around, things like that. That game could have been a completely different story, and that could have been a game that the Vikings absolutely choked, a game that was 29-0. So the Vikings, a team that was really good at times, but then they also showed their lack of consistency, which is what kind of cost them. But at the end of the day, I think the Vikings are a very, very good football team. It's just their inability to close games last year, their inability to play a full 60 minutes of football is what really kind of cost the Minnesota Vikings in their season. Because as we mentioned, 6-8 in one possession games, they played 14 of them. So it's not like the Vikings were out of these games. They just literally could not finish. And I think if the Vikings finished those games, obviously they're a playoff team. Look at all the games that we listed earlier in the video. The Vikings could have won every single one of them. And to make things worse for the Minnesota Vikings, just to show how close they were, first of all, they were one game under 500. They had an 8-9 record last year, but then they also had a 1-point differential. They had a negative 1-point differential. So of all the times that they scored and their opponents score, the Vikings were outscored by 1 point last year. Like, I can't emphasize enough. I don't think the Minnesota Vikings could have tried to make things closer even if they wanted to. Like, I don't know how much closer the Vikings could have made things for themselves last season. This team was on the brink so many times of closing out games, being a playoff team, and they were just on the unfortunate end on a lot of these games. And if we look at the Vikings, they were even able to beat the Packers last year, which is kind of the point of this video. In their division, can they compete in their division? And they even split the season series last year with the Packers. Now, Kirk Cousins did miss the second game against the Packers last year, so who knows how different that game could have been, because it was a really bad football game, let's be honest, between the Vikings and the Packers. That was a Sunday night game, but you take into account that Kirk Cousins wasn't there. If he plays, he does struggle in primetime, and that was a primetime game. But you play Kirk Cousins in that game, things may be different for the Minnesota Vikings because, like I said, they beat the Packers once earlier in the season. They always seem to beat the Packers at least once, but at least against the Packers, I like the chances of the Vikings up against the Packers, especially if you look at the talent that they have. First, we have to acknowledge the fact that they have a new head coach. And a lot of the issues that could be stemmed to the Minnesota Vikings issues last year could have been the head coach, because Mike Zimmer got very conservative at times. Because I don't think Kirk Cousins is the problem. Because if we're looking at the quarterback position, I think Kirk Cousins is a very good quarterback. If we look at his numbers since 2015, actually, the numbers have literally been consistent all the way down the board. Not a single thing has really changed with Kirk Cousins in nearly 7 years. Like, he has been consistent for 7 years. And people are like, well, he's stealing the NFL of money because he signed a 1-year, $35 million extension with the Minnesota Vikings. But I mean, if you look at the numbers that Kirk Cousins puts up, they're very consistent, and they're not bad numbers whatsoever. He has very good statistical numbers. Now, Minnesota Vikings fans can tell me where I'm wrong with that. I'm perfectly fine with that. But if we're looking at the whole as a whole, Kirk Cousins is a talented quarterback. Mike Zimmer, may have been the reason why the Minnesota Vikings had so many failures and the inability to make the playoffs is because he did get conservative. But with him gone and Rick Spielman gone, they have a new head coach and a new GM. They hired Kevin O'Connell from the Rams, so that should completely shift the offensive side of the ball, at least for the Vikings. Because as we mentioned, the Vikings were a really good offense, even with Mike Zimmer there as the head coach. They were a really good offense. And then you look, like I said, I've already mentioned the quarterback with Kirk Cousins, but then you look at Justin Jefferson, who's been lighting up the NFL his first 2 seasons. Like, he's had unbelievable first 2 seasons. His first season, he had 88 receptions, 1,400 yards, 7 touchdowns. That was his rookie year. Like, he was putting up elite level numbers that you see in year 3 and 4 from wide receivers. He was doing that year 1. Year 2 got even better. He had 108 receptions, 1,616 yards, and 10 touchdowns in year 2. So realistically, Justin Jefferson keeps this production up. He could be a 2,000-yard receiver at some point in his career, putting up 15, 16 touchdowns. Like, Justin Jefferson is already an elite status level wide receiver. They have an unbelievable run game with Dalvin Cook. He's one of the better running backs in the NFL. Last year, he had 1,159 yards, 6 touchdowns, but that was in 13 games. So if he had played every game last season, he probably breaks the 1,500-yard mark. So they have an unbelievable receiver. They have an unbelievable running back. They have a quarterback that's very, very consistent, and a new head coach in Kevin O'Connell, who comes from the Rams system, and Sean McVay. So you know that offense is going to be, centered around the strengths of the players. He's going to be able to scheme them open. The offense was already good, and I think it's going to be even better with Kevin O'Connell. And then you have a good supporting cast that the Minnesota Vikings have with Adam Thielen and KJ Osborne. The Vikings are primed on offense to be a very good football team. Now, obviously, with the Vikings, their biggest struggle was their defense. They had the 30th ranked defense in the NFL last year. Their secondary wasn't particularly good at all. Their pass defense wasn't one of the best. It was kind of bad last year. But in the draft, they absolutely hit on, I think, what they needed. They drafted a whole bunch of secondary players, so I can assume that their secondary is going to be even better. And then you look at the division with the Packers, who lost a lot of their good wide receivers. I still like the Packers. I still like them to win the division, but I like the Minnesota Vikings' chances. But you look at a division where the Packers lost their talent. I mean, the Lions, they got a few good receivers in Jameson Williams, and then they also have Amon-Ra St. Brown. And then you have the Bears, who, I think are not a good football team, especially offensively when it comes to the weapons side of the ball, the wide receiving position. I think division-wise, I think the Minnesota Vikings are honestly a team that could make noise in their division, and I think they can keep up with the Packers. They just added Zadarius Smith from the Packers on their defense. Now, health might be an issue with him because he did miss most of last year. But all in all, with the Minnesota Vikings, as I laid it out, they are a team that was literally on the brink of making the playoffs. They are a team that easily could have won 11 games last year, 12 games last year. I just think silly mistakes on their own part cost them their season, and it was early on in the season that kind of cost them. There was games early last year that they should have won, and maybe things are different for them. And with a new head coach, I think those issues that the Vikings had last year aren't going to necessarily be a thing. And I think the Vikings really do have a chance in their division. I still think the Packers are the favorites, but when it comes to them competing in their division, getting better, and actually being a team that isn't constantly choking games all the time, I think the Vikings this year really do have a chance of being a really good football team. But those are just my thoughts on the Minnesota Vikings and their chances of competing in the NFC North. Tell me where I'm wrong, Vikings fans. I will happily be wrong. Give me your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in the next one.